Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today I'm honored to have as a guest today our longtime collaborator and researcher, Wendell Cox, who runs an organization called Demographia, which maintains the largest private database on housing affordability in the world. Wendell and Joel just published a new report on housing called Blame Ourselves, Not Our Stars, where the premise is that the big problem we have in the housing world is a series of missteps that came from government policy that reacted to our revulsion at suburban sprawl. Wendell, do you want to walk us through what happened and why we are where we are?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If you go back to 1969, which was the year, by the way, that I think the California housing laws really began, at that time, California housing was about as affordable as the rest of the country in relation to incomes. And, having a price to income ratio or median multiple of about 3 or less in all of the metropolitan areas, all the major metropolitan areas. And over the period since that time, we've had just an incredible increase in regulation. There was CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. There were all sorts of growth control measures in the Bay Area in the 80s and the 90s. Then it got more serious when urban growth boundaries were adopted in places like Santa Clara County and Alameda County. 2008 really was a bad year for housing affordability when Senate Bill 375 was passed that put all sorts of serious limits on the expansion of urban areas and housing on the periphery. And the basic problem is that the policies of California make it almost impossible to build single-family housing, which is the housing that people want, and almost impossible to build on or beyond the urban fringe. And when you draw a circle around the urban fringe, which is what these policies do, you raise the price of land, just like when OPEC raises the price or cuts back production, gas prices go up. And the increases have been incredible. I mean, at this point, our latest data is showing the San Jose metropolitan area, that's Santa Clara and San Benito County, as having a price to income ratio near 12, not the under 3 that it had in 1969. So that's, the basics of the problem.
Wow. So Pave Paradise put up a parking lot. They took it too seriously, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
And it's important for us to understand, and Wendell's done this work, I've done it all over the world myself, which is, basically these policies are being adopted, not everywhere. In most of the United States, as Wendell can point out, have not adopted these policies, but in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and in those parts of the US where these policies have been adopted, the same pattern is there. And what's really ironic is very often they say, well, what we'll do is we'll deal with the cost of housing by building more density. Well, there are several problems there. A, dense housing is more expensive to build. It's not particularly—
Which is somewhat counterintuitive.
Right.
You would think that
yes,
if you'd be putting up more housing units on a smaller footprint, that it would be somehow cheaper. But what you're saying, it is not.
It's not. And there's been pretty extensive research on this. And, most people who are, whatever their position is, they're going to, more or less say it is expensive per unit to build. And of course, the other problem is this notion that you can solve the housing problem by density also basically, gives up on the possibility of home ownership. Home ownership for all the Anglo-Saxon countries, all the countries that are, even the United States, which is more or less an offshoot of Great Britain in a historic sense, all these countries have the exact same issue, the exact same problem. Its origin started in the post-war UK, and these regulations have had a disastrous effect. And one last thing is when you restrict development on the fringe, it's not just the fringe that is hurt. It's the city, because let me put it this way. I'm a real estate speculator, and I know that 80% of all development in the Bay Area is going to have to be on 4 to 5% of the land. If I have that land, I'm really, you don't have to be Milton Friedman to figure out that you're going to make a lot of money on that. So what you do is you make prices. When people ask, why is a new apartment in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Vancouver or Toronto or London $3,000-4,000 for one bedroom? That doesn't seem to be a particular cheap alternative. So this is not only a California problem, it's a global problem, and is beginning to become a real American problem as well.
Well, Wendell, if you don't mind, let's just dive into the weeds a little bit here, because I think our listeners are going to be quite interested in what are the 4 or 5 killer policies, the things that we did to shoot ourselves in the foot that get in the way of the development. How do they restrict it?
Well, there really are 2 things in California. The first, and I think, frankly, the least important, is CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that gives essentially just about anybody that doesn't like some development that's going to occur in some area of California the ability to challenge it. And we've seen projects, single-family home projects held up, I think, as much as 30 to 40 years going through this. Well, that makes it impossible. The big issue, though, has to do with the very real restrictions on building single-family housing or any housing on the urban fringe or beyond. And that really is it. That is those 2 are the whole story.
And is that a state restriction, or is that a local government restriction?
Both. We have urban growth boundaries in places like Alameda County and Santa Clara County and so on. But we also have this Sustainable Communities Initiative out of the Senate Bill 375 from 2008 that basically makes it almost impossible to build on the urban fringe. And the whole idea is we're going to take all of California's growth and force it into a very limited area, and the price of land goes up, so that, for example, where Ed Glazer of Harvard and Joe Giorco of University of Pennsylvania point out that traditionally land has represented 20% of the cost of a new house. In San Francisco, it's more like 65% at this point. So it is land that is driving this, the cost of land. And that's something that a lot of the reformers who basically see municipal zoning reform as the answer miss the boat, because they don't understand that what's going on is at the state and regional level, you're forcing up the price of land, and whatever you do that improves zoning is only after the impact of these regional and state mandates with respect to the region.
I also think that there's, Marshall, and this is fitting into our podcast theme closely, is that what we're essentially doing is we're consigning the next generation here in California. Also, in same issues are emerging in Toronto and Vancouver and other areas that have similar issues. And that is what we're consigning the next generation to, a future where they can't possibly ever buy a house, and that they're going to be renters for life. And how does that affect us? We know, and Marshall, you've worked on this as well. What we're doing is we're making it very, very difficult for young people to ever buy a house. And so what's happening is we're losing some rich people, we're losing some poor people, but what's really serious is we're losing people in the middle age, in the period where they want to form a family, and they are also probably at their economic peak. And we're losing those people. And it is very depressing to talk to bright people who, including some of our younger colleagues at Chapman, who would love to stay here, want to be in California. I'm a great believer in California myself, but they can't afford a future here. And we're just, as Marshall, you put it, we're eating our own seed corn.
Well, and the other thing is that we have kind of misguided notions about social engineering. That somehow, if we tell everybody, look, density is good, go ahead, forget about having your own single family home with a yard in the back, get a nice condo someplace. You could still be a homeowner, but you're going to have to be in a big, dense dense apartment complex, basically, that you own instead of rent, you're going to have to like that. Well, it turns out that people actually don't like that. And so we're forcing them into this mold. So wave a wand for me. How do we fix this?
Well, the key, and Joel and I have recommended this in the paper, the key is to begin to do some reform to get these land costs under control. Now, the Central Valley, and actually I would say from Shasta County essentially to Imperial County and interior counties, is more affordable than the rest of the state. It's not as affordable as it should be, but you could save an awful lot of money living in Fresno or Bakersfield or Redding compared to what it would cost you in the Bay Area or the Los Angeles area or Southern California. So what we're recommending is the development of what we call a housing opportunity area that would exempt land in these counties from urban containment regulations and most CEQA regulations, and basically restore the kind of market that created the prosperity of California and made it possible for middle-class people as late as, and households as late as 1969 to afford middle-class housing. They can't anymore. So that I think is the way you go. You start to work on that. And in the long run, that would mean now when somebody decides, it's just too expensive to live in San Jose, I'm going to move to Texas or Nevada. Now you're going to have an alternative to stay in California. So other than that, the domestic migration situation in California is unbelievable. I don't think we had the data when we wrote the paper, but the out-migration in just 2 years, net domestic out-migration is almost equal to the population of the city of San Francisco, over 800,000 people.
Wow, that's an astounding number. And let's probe this just a little bit further. One of the things that we have that exists as a trend is this post-pandemic preference for remote work. How do you think that impacts this whole discussion?
Well, I think this is one of the central things. And weirdly enough, the state of California, despite its supposed commitment to reducing carbon emissions, has shown very little interest in remote work. And continues to suggest that people need to take the emission spewing commutes 5 days a week. That's what that seems to be what is preferred. And the reality is that the work at home cat is out of the bag. People have experienced it. Companies realize that maybe there are certain people that we don't want to lose, but they don't want to live in a 1-bedroom condo in San Jose, and they've gotten a place in Davis, California, one of the fast-growing places in Yolo County. And maybe the person can come in once a week, or when there's a need for him or her to come in.
Well, but Joel, does this kind of imply that we're triaging downtowns? That we're basically saying, hey, let them die?
Well, no, I think the reality is the more we hold on to the myth that the transactional city based on high-rise office building and the expansion of that sector, you've got to get past that. City leaders have got to say, okay, what are we going to do as a city? And I've just finished an essay on this, and Wendell and I have dealt with this. There are many things cities can do. First of all, there's always going to be that 10 to 15% of the population that wants density. That's been true since the 50s and 60s.
Well, earlier than that, the whole growth of cities historically has been right. People want it. There are some people who feel comfortable in that density environment.
Right. And so the problem, of course, may be that they can't afford to be there. But there are certain industries, media, finance, which are, always going to have, I think, an orientation to larger cities. So they have a role. And I think the real richness of cities, and cities that have ignored this, are their neighborhoods. If you can live, particularly in a big city like LA, but even in, let's say, New York or San Francisco, and you can live in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn or in Noe Valley or Los Angeles, and you can basically stay in that area for most of your time, shop there, go to, work there. That is going to be the key. What we're finding is that, for instance, business in Brooklyn has been doing much better than business in Manhattan, because you don't have that constant flow of people coming into the downtown. It's a new world, and cities have to find their place in it. I think they can find their place in it, but they're going to have to do something about crime. They're going to have to do something about the homeless, and they're going to have to improve the economic environment.
Wendell, who is doing it right?
Who is doing it right? Well, that, first of all, where it is being done right, it was never intended. Okay. Okay. I mean, people always ask me that question. I'd say, well, what about Kansas City? What about Indianapolis? Here you go to those places, you don't find any of these regulations. What we need is government to get out of the way. Government does not have the answer. I mean, you look at the United Kingdom, where houses were costing 2 to 3 times incomes after the war, and they imposed this incredibly dysfunctional urban planning model that has now swept the world, and housing is 8 times incomes now in London. It's unbelievable. And so we have to understand, planning is not the way to go. The way to go is to allow the market to operate. You need regulation. There's nothing wrong with reasonable regulation, but reasonable regulation does not basically say you can't build in the next lot because it's outside this land that some bureaucrat has set.
Well, and I also think that, Marshall, you asked a good question about models. Well, I know Californians are not ever supposed to say anything nice about Texans or about Texas, but, I've spent a lot of time particularly in the Houston area, but also in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And they're building communities that are environmentally sustainable, have lots of open space, where they're counting on a large proportion of the population working at home. They're building town centers. And what's happened is these kind of developments, which, by the way, we in California pioneered. We built Irvine, we built Valencia, we built Foster City. We have shown that we are capable of building very sustainable, and I mean sustainable both environmentally and for the human beings. We know how to do it. The regulations that Wendell's referring to make it virtually impossible. Think about this. How do I build an Irvine in a situation where I cannot guarantee the single family homeowner that somebody's not going to put an apartment next to them? How am I going to ever get anything approved? And that's why what I find interesting is I talk sometimes it's sort of funny in some ways. You talk to developers in Texas, and half of them are from California. So a lot of them still live in California, because I'll be the first one to say, if I have a choice between living in California and living in Texas, and if I could afford both, I'm going to live in California because it's a nicer place.
It strikes me that the core of the argument that you have here is that we have the land. It's not a question of we're not Singapore.
Right.
We are completely limited by the amount of land we have. We have the land, and when we use the land for expansion, take Orange County as an example, we seem to do it pretty responsibly, right? We are able to put in those regulations that avoid the Joni Mitchell, put up a parking lot problem. Is that true?
Yeah, pretty much. I think you're right.
So, what do you say to the environmentalists?
Well, I think my sense is you have to step back and ask what it is you're trying to do. Okay. Now, these laws and regulations are largely intended to address the problem of urban sprawl. Recognize that in California, 95% of the land is not developed. The cities only cover 5% of the land. So not sure urban sprawl is so big a deal. My view is when we adopt these kinds of policies, we are basically saying to low-income people, you don't matter. Much more important, poverty, in my view, is far worse than urban sprawl. And we have allowed the planners to basically create a situation in which the cardinal sin is urban sprawl. And we're quite happy. They don't say it, but they're quite happy to consign all sorts of people to poverty. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, there's some great work, and we've had her on the show that Jennifer Hernandez has done, what she calls the green Jim Crow, where, what we decide is, well, we're going to reduce climate change by density, which is itself not necessarily something that's actually particularly accurate. But anyway, you can make that argument. But what's happening is, for an entire generation of young Californians, and particularly Californians from historically disadvantaged groups like Latinos and African Americans, their home ownership rates are considerably lower in California, and many of them will never move up. We forget that even though there were bad restrictions on race, for instance, in where people could live, including also restrictions on my own ethnic group. The fact is, people did manage to buy houses. Much of South LA was filled with, hardworking African-American families who could afford a little bungalow in South LA. Now, you could look down on it, but I'll tell you one thing, it's a hell of a lot better than living in the South Bronx, where I was recently. I just think that what we're doing is a social engineering, which is negative in terms of its impact on the class structure, and is essentially consigning people to make a choice between permanent serfdom or leaving California. I don't think that is a responsible choice for us to be offering.
So your main point here is that dictating density leads to poverty. It drives poverty.
Yeah.
And I don't think that connection is really there in people's minds, right? I think people are still in this, oh my God, the planet is about to fall apart, and so we need to do whatever it is that we can do to save the planet. And so the old, Joni Mitchell line of pave paradise, put up a parking lot, still rings true in people's minds, even though it's not at all true.
And of course, a great irony to me, which I get a great kick out of, is I once spoke to a League of Conservation Voters group, and they were ranting and raving about sprawl. And I said, by the way, where do you guys live? And of course, every single one had at least one house, usually in suburbia. Somehow it's okay for them, but for Mr. Garcia, who's been working his ass off and wants to buy a little house in Riverside, somehow that's a crime against the planet and humanity. And so the hypocrisy of being told you have to live a life that's more like what our grandparents endured. So, but meanwhile, the environmentalists who have a lot of people with a lot of money, they fly around the country, they fly around the world, they have numerous homes, and they don't exactly live small.
Yeah, and I'd love to, just as we move into kind of the final portion of this, Wendell, you are a transportation expert. You've been on the board of the LA Metro. It strikes me that when you think about the old urban sprawl argument, basically people said, well, we don't want to push things out into the periphery because we don't want to have gigantic commuting problems of people having to go from their remote location into whatever the downtown is. And it strikes me that entire paradigm of commuting is now completely upended. Is that true? And kind of how will this remote work trend affect the whole transportation policy?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that what you're saying was first identified in the 2000 census over 20 years ago, that in fact, downtowns are not that important in terms of employment. No, the majority of people who live in Irvine or in Fullerton, the majority of them do not go to downtown Los Angeles. The majority of people who live in Livermore don't go to to San Francisco, and the remote work phenomenon only makes that more. But the point is that that transit, which, by the way, I was a great advocate of in my days on the LA County Transportation Commission, transit doesn't have it. And by that, I mean, you go to any major US metropolitan area and you ask, well, now just how many jobs can I get to in 30 minutes by transit? And how many jobs can I get to by car? Now in New York, in the New York metropolitan area, you can get to 5 times as many jobs by car in 30 minutes as you can on transit. And that's as good as it gets. The average among the 56 metropolitan areas that are more than 1 million is something like 60 times. And so the problem is transit makes an awful lot of sense to downtown. But with downtown becoming less important, and my own view is you're not going to ever see some of these downtowns restored to their former glory, as it were. We have less need for transit to downtown. And if you work anywhere but downtown, you really can't use transit.
Well, it just strikes me that we're seeing a complete shift because of this remote work trend in the fundamental underlying assumptions. Not only is the lack of single-family housing driving poverty, but the assumption that somehow urban sprawl or suburban sprawl will continue because of commute times is also completely overturned. And a lot of this comes from your research, the two of you. So I applaud you in that. The report is Blame Ourselves, Not Our Stars, which is available for anybody to download on the Center for Demographics and Policy site at Chapman University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The Feudal